first presenter is Dr. Jeff Malecki. After graduating from Central Michigan University, Dr. Malecki has directed wind bands and orchestras throughout the country in middle schools, high schools, and collegiate levels. He's led groups abroad in Dublin and Rome, as well as performing on euphonium in Cambridge and in Peru. After completing graduate studies in conducting at UNLV, he led ensembles at St. Xavier University in Chicago, while also coordinating the music education program, which he also does here. Joining the faculty of USD in 2015, he had the privilege of building the university's first formal band program. In addition to leading the wind ensemble, torero, pep band, and drumline, he has taught courses in theory, history, conducting, and has been a part of USD's iPad initiative for 3 years, and has helped raise the profile of the band across campus and the community. And then our second speaker will be Dr. Marianne Pfau. Dr. Pfau came to USD in 1989, and 11 years ago she began the Angelus Sacred Music Series in Founders Chapel, which we just experienced this previous weekend, in order to mark the liturgical season of Lent with a special concert at USD. In her native Germany, she trained as a performer of early music and then received her license as music therapist from the Guildhall School of Music in London, finally earning a PhD in musicology at Stony Brook University in New York. Her many publications on Hildegard of Bingen and her editions of music for Baroque oboe from European archives, as well as her recordings of the transatlantic ensemble Tout Suite, have established Dr. Pfau as a scholar artist who seeks out the connections between historical studies, active performance, and explorations of music for healing purposes. So please welcome our first speaker, Dr. Jeff Malecki.
So we're going to talk about beauty as well as joy in music with two philosophers of sorts in those areas. Very different, but strains that run through them similarly as well. Edward Hanslick, 1825 to 1904, they're originally from Bohemia, but did most of his professional work in Vienna, which was really the center of musical culture during that Romantic period. He was one of the first music critics who was making a living critiquing other music, critically, we could say. And that's considered very academic. He gets into music theory as well, although he didn't actually do much analysis himself. But that wasn't something that existed before Hanslick, and he's very mainstream with it. Now, when he picks that up, Vienna, that area of Central Europe, in the middle of the Romantic period, is just the hotbed for every opinion and every type of music you could possibly ever want. The first, Schumann, of course, ends up being a very established music critic in his own right. Around the time of Hanslick, is just as revered as a composer as the later names there. And of course, we have the next two, Brahms and Wagner. What fun guys. Hanslick is great friends with Brahms. Brahms writes what we call absolute music. If we're used to Brahms pieces, we might be used to Symphony No. 1, or, dare I say, Symphony No. 2, or I really like Symphony No. 4. I got you. That is what absolute music is. Absolute music is music for music's sake. It doesn't necessarily tell a story. The composer doesn't intend it to tell a story. And as I talked to some classes here about that, you could certainly listen to a Brahms symphony and say, this reminds me of the ocean. But someone right next to you could say, this reminds me of birds. Neither one of you is right, neither one of you is wrong. That's part of the fun of absolute music, and that's the way Brahms composed most of his works. Wagner, on the very other hand, there was a meaning to everything. There were probably 30 meanings to everything. Hanslick, Wagner, not friends, not getting along at all. And of course, I just threw Nietzsche up there, the philosopher, not the musician, so to speak, but to give you an idea of kind of the hotbed of thought going on there. Nietzsche, who was best friends with Wagner right before he was worst enemies with Wagner, both wonderfully neurotic personalities. Hanslick writes a book in 1851, and when Dr. Clack asked me to do this clinic, this talk, I was actually in here working with a class in the Humanities Center. He said, we're doing the series Beauty and Music, would you be interested in contributing? And that was right before I was doing a lecture that has similar parts to this, where I used references to this same book that happened to be called The Beautiful in Music. I said, yes, I think I have something that just might work. So he writes that right in the middle of the 19th century there, 1851. We can see that picture. Some people said, as far as a critic, he was so friendly with Brahms, that there was maybe a little bit of worship, just a political cartoon there, but we kind of get an idea of what he looks like. So what did that beauty in music say? Hanslick's goal in criticism was to be as objective as possible, not to put his own opinion in there, but to find a way to analyze music that was just black and white. That was his goal. He said music at its core is just sound or pitches in time, and it's really nothing more than that at its core, just those basics. As far as feeling and emotion in music, it's not as connected as maybe we think of today. The composer's shouldn't be, or he was saying, putting that thought into the actual compositions. If it does emote feelings, that's great, but it's not tied directly to the music. When we said earlier that maybe we're listening to a Brahms symphony and thinking about the ocean, that's what you're thinking. Hanslick is saying you probably shouldn't even be thinking that one thing. Broaden that and don't tie it to something else. This isn't a new idea by any stretch. It goes all the way back to the Greeks, where music is such a unique thing that stands by itself. Even in art, it doesn't have any specific meaning. It stands by itself. To contrast that, and I don't think I see any art faculty here, so we can.
One.
I'm sorry, right in front of me. I'm sorry. So we can have a wonderful little debate here as we go into the next slide. A wonderful painting that I use whenever I'm talking about romanticism in music. We talk about romanticism more broadly, politically, and in visual art. And when we look at this wonderful Delacroix painting, Lady Liberty there, we can go through so many wonderful details that have meaning. Why is there a woman and not a man? Anyone?
Well, it was typical of allegorical figures. They were frequently made female.
Yeah, and especially with this, Lady Liberty has stuck. And we have that symbolism today. If we see some, let's pick, certainly when I'm teaching classes, we like the guy in the lower left. The poor man has no pants. That certainly has meaning. Does anyone know the specific meaning of why someone wouldn't be wearing pants?
Because the French military would knock on your door in the middle of the night and drag you out and kill you. And so he's in his sleeping clothes.
Absolutely. So it has incredible intent. That is what the artist wanted to portray in this just a beautiful piece of art that it's very well informed. But music, Hanslick argues, does not have that clear line. Now, as more art faculty walk in. Now, certainly, Hanslick wouldn't have been familiar with someone like Jackson Pollock or all the modernists. And that could be a whole different debate. But I think with this, we can see how music stands alone and doesn't have that deliberate meaning. He also talks about interpretation a little bit. One of the reasons we shouldn't get caught up with the interpretation at the moment. We're going to listen to just a little bit of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. And many of us probably know the story. But I was thinking about this. Since we're talking about Bernstein, I was finding some recordings of Bernstein doing Rite of Spring. They weren't the best recordings in the world. But I was thinking, what's the first time I ever heard Rite of Spring? Does anyone remember the first time they heard Rite of Spring? And I bet some of us have common experiences.
Fantasia, the 1940 version.
Yeah, the old Fantasia. I remember watching that when I was little. Who's seen that? Yeah, that was my experience when I was a wee lad. Let's watch just a little bit of this Rite of Spring. And tell me what feelings are coming to mind here. What do we have?
Sense of beauty, expansiveness, primordial, mysterious.
Yeah, I think they intended the primordial, and that came across really well. One of the first words you said was beauty. You're in the right place. Good. What else?
Anticipation.
Oh, interesting.
I'm definitely waiting for something. Just because it was just the volume of expectation just keep going up and up and up. I was waiting for the sort of
You're saying nervous anticipation, a complacent anticipation, angry anticipation.
a fulfilling anticipation. It was nice. I was waiting for something, but I was okay in the wait.
I was keeping my eye on everyone, and no one went to throw their chair at anyone else. So that was good. We're used to this 1940s, which is, it seems like a long time ago now, but relatively recent, although closer to the premiere than to modern day. Disney version. We see the visual that they're giving us. And Hanslick says that's not what we really want. This is one way to look at it, but we shouldn't tie that to what Stravinsky wrote. Now, Stravinsky, of course, wrote a ballet. He didn't mean it to be completely absolute music to begin with. But the story goes at the actual premiere, just those first notes of a bassoon, which had never been played that high before, started waking up people's nervousness and excitement to the point where there were riots, there were fires, there were chairs being thrown. Like the orchestra couldn't hear themselves play. Stravinsky had to come and backstage conduct. It was just an immense, horrible, wonderful cacophony that night because this music was riotous. In that audience in the early 1910s, that is what they took away from it. That's very different from me as a little old non-tenured faculty member. I felt confident being able to show that to you and not be fired because no one burned down the Humanities Center. So I think that illustrates our point that Hanslick is saying, where we don't want to tie our interpretation as far as our audience, our place, our time, our location to the piece either. We can go back to the PowerPoint. And I should also say I have to apologize, but one other thing I thought of, this audience would be much different watching this piece, as I have to leave a little bit early to go wave my baton at a bunch of 6th and 7th grade band members. That would be another interpretation completely different from this one. So when I run away, I apologize in advance. And that's that interpretation. So that starts our conversation of Hanslick. Hanslick was definitely an academic. This book, it's not necessarily incredibly long, but I would say personally, my opinion is it's fairly dense. There's a lot to it, I think. I've never read it from cover to cover. I don't know if I ever will. But we can pull some of these general ideas about what he thinks music is and what beauty in music is. Now, Leonard Bernstein on the opposite spectrum is a different character. He's turning 100 years old this August, which is why almost every opera company is doing some wonderful candides and whatever else. He was a composer. We mentioned Candide there. Of course, he's very famous for West Side Story, the musical. He wrote symphonies, more absolute music. He wrote a mass. He wrote a great output. I've played his elegies for Mippy, which he wrote for his dog, for foot tapping and trombone on several occasions. A very prolific composer. He was a conductor. The way he actually caught it big was he was the assistant conductor in the New York Philharmonic. Bruno Walter was the head conductor. Bruno Walter was very old. Bruno Walter got ill. They kind of shoved him in there last minute with very little notice, and he did an outstanding job. New York papers loved him, as opposed to kind of these old, gray-haired 70s, 80s conductors. All of a sudden, there was this vibrant young guy in front of the New York Philharmonic doing some good work. But whereas Hanslick was definitely an academic, I used the word educator for Bernstein. I was tempted to put in the word populist, although nowadays it might have a negative connotation somewhat. But he wanted to bring this music to the people. In the book that we're going to talk about with him, the whole second half, is anyone familiar with the Omnibus series, old Omnibus series from I think it started in '59, which ended up growing into his Young People's Concerts, which were on NBC through the 60s into the early 70s. These were shows on TV, and for the USD students, if you're not familiar with them, it's really shocking, I think, that students, families, would gather around their TVs. I can't remember what night it was on, but it was before my time. I never watched it live. And watch Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic teach little kids sonata form for an hour. And people loved it. I've talked to my mom. She's like, yeah, A, B, and then there's a recapitulation at the end. And I was like, Mom, what? So he's very much trying to communicate to the people and bring things, whether they're West Side Story, whether they're his denser symphonies, to the people. 1959, just over 100 years after Hanslick wrote his Beauty in Music, he writes The Joy of Music. So let's talk about that a little bit. The beginning, and it's pure personal, subjective taste here, but I think he's wonderful in every way. I just love Bernstein. The opening section is really just so tongue-in-cheek and wonderful. It has different parts. One for Leonard Bernstein himself, one for his younger brother, who pretty much just is chewing gum the whole time, and one for a lyric poet, because that's very Bernstein as he trances around in his capes. They're driving through New Mexico and having discussions about music and life. And one of the first things they say is the lyric poet, silence, driving through New Mexico. The lyric poet says, "These hills are pure Beethoven." Bernstein says, "What do you mean by that? Please explain. How can a hill be Beethoven? And why is it Beethoven? Why isn't it Mozart? If you're saying hills are pretty and Beethoven's pretty, isn't Mozart pretty? Is all of Beethoven like a hill? Is some like a mountain? Is some like a stream?" And Bernstein takes this poor lyric poet to task, going through melody and harmony and form and expression, every little form of music, arguing that, like Hanslick says, we shouldn't tie a mountain directly to the music like that, or a hill. A whole second little discussion here starts, are we embarking on the study of the meaning of meaning? And for a little bit there it goes so wordy and overdone in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. It makes fun of itself. But what I'm going to bring more specifically here is let's talk more simply. Our lyric poet starts that line. He says, and I was thinking about doing voices, but I won't put you through that. But let's talk more simply. You will admit that there is a definite relation between the meaning of a sunset and a Chopin prelude. Bernstein says, relation, yes, in a comprehensive critical sense, but that is not to say that they mean the same thing. Our lyric poet, of course, it is to say just that. Take the sunset and the prelude, for example. We can break their meaning down into certain abstract terms like calm, spaciousness, sostenuto, gentle motion, color, imperceptible changes of color, and so on. All of these terms apply to both, don't they? When we were talking about some of those terms to Rite of Spring, we could pull the same argument. Bernstein, but the prelude doesn't mean calm, color, and the rest. It suggests them, perhaps, but what it means is purely musical. That last line could have come directly out of Hanslick, even though these two are so different in so many ways. As the book goes on, he's certainly using different anecdotes to keep this conversation going. He excerpts his omnibus series, the actual television scripts. He talks about his Beethoven Fifth Symphony, and they talk about looking at original Beethoven sketches and saying, what if it was in C major instead of C minor? What would happen? What if he changed the form and did this instead? What if he extended the ending? What if he cut the ending? What would that sound like? He talks about jazz, things like improvisation. He talks about Bach, which is so similar and so different from jazz in many ways, conducting, his main means of income there, what makes opera grand and American musical comedy. This great swath of all of what music is, whether it's a little bit more of the historical side, whether it's more of the theoretical side, coming together. So that's where I think Bernstein is taking some ideas from Hanslick, and he ends up contradicting himself in certain terms, especially when he's more off the cuff. As the older he gets, he ends up doing a series of lectures at Harvard and becomes a little bit more academic on some of these subjects. But although he's not explicitly talking about beauty there, I think that overarching comprehensive look at music is what he's giving us as far as his definition of joy. So we're going to wrap up with one more musical example because it's called Beauty in Music, so that makes sense. We're going to listen to Mahler, who is one of the favorite composers of Bernstein. This is the Adagio, the fourth movement to his Fifth Symphony in C sharp minor. However, this movement is in D major. So we'll press play and let this go for maybe a minute or two. And again, I want you to come up with some adjectives. Start with, I'm happy, I'm sad.
I felt forlorn, but in a contemplative mood. In other words, of something that happened in the past, but nonetheless you're recalling it, and so you understand it somewhat conceptually, but it's sort of veiled in a certain way, so that it brings up the emotion of something that you desire, but on the other hand, it's unachievable and unapproachable.
So still
Very
vague.
complex.
Great.
It felt to me like a delusion of euphoria, like you're in this state of euphoria, but there's things that are not quite right, and perhaps it's not entirely appropriate to the circumstances.
Yeah, because we're not completely consonant there. Great.
Anticipation, but then as it went on, it felt like unfulfilled anticipation.
So this kind of, a common theme is almost a question mark. Last comment, the venerable Dr. Sheen.
It's very hard for me to disassociate this music from the film Death in Venice.
And we'll talk about some of the uses for it in addition to that one score, absolutely. So of course we're doing exactly what Hanslick is telling us not to do, and putting other things than just listening to the music. But I think with this piece in particular, it's called Adagio, so little adagio. Adagio means slow, which somewhat I think implies that it shouldn't be too slow, but at the same time, the actual tempo marking is sehr langsam, very slow. Some recordings last 8 minutes. The record, I believe, is over 15. I haven't heard that one. I should look it up. Bernstein was on the 12-minute side, usually. It's interesting that we keep having this question mark. Now, if we go to the very next slide, Mahler writes so much of this heavy, forlorn, depressing music. This one little sliver is a happiness in his life. The only little nugget that we know about it, that we could kind of put in there, it's not 100% vetted, but his wife, Alma, for whom he wrote it as a love letter, she shared a letter with the conductor Mengelberg, I believe after Mahler's death, saying, "This is the poem that Gustav gave me." The second line, I cannot tell you in words. That just about brings all of this, I think, to summation. Now that said, this is Gustav, if you're giving a love letter to someone you love, that implies happiness, I think. I'm single. My dog doesn't really mind me too much. I don't know. Ask Gustav instead of me. But we have some movie references. The way Bernstein used this piece was to play it at the funeral of Robert F. Kennedy. And ever since then, Bernstein carried with us as a funeral piece. Not to say it was a horrible dies irae in my face, but more of a song of mourning. It was also played by the New York Philharmonic, I believe, the day after 9/11. Is it to be more consoling? Is it to be more kind of vaguely contemplative? That still stays absolute. Mahler's intent was for it to be absolute with no specific meaning, but we can find these little strains. So, to wrap things up with what I think is this wonderful, gorgeous piece, I'm a big Mahler fan. I have some dirt from his grave in my office. That much. I think we start with Hanslick when we're talking about beauty and music. And music doesn't need to have anything other than music associated with it to be absolutely gorgeous, just standing by itself. Bernstein, I think, fleshes that out a little bit, and as he's actually programming pieces, does a little bit, not what he says, but what he does, and associates these pieces with more specific events or people, place, things, whatever. So that's my little, that's my 2 cents on beauty and music. Since I am leaving, were there any, maybe just a minute or two of questions, or?
I think it was very apropos to use it for Kennedy, because it was that kind of, again, an unfulfilled anticipation. There was so much hope and promise with him, and then it just evaporated.
Mm-hmm.
And just such depression when that happened. It was just, people were just let down. It was so tragic.
Mm-hmm.
Good choice.
I'll tell Leonard.
But I can't tell you when I first heard the Rites of Spring, but the performance that stays with me that made the most impact on me was seeing the ballet.
Mm-hmm.
which is still as shocking. Not that people were throwing things or running out of the theater or whatnot, but because it has this real pagan feel to it.
Absolutely. Wearing very non-traditional, non-expected, not wearing tutus anymore, but wearing burlap bags, just about, absolutely.
Okay, so Jeff, are you sure you can't say that Mahler didn't have any extra musical meaning to that when he writes that?
That's where I say it's a gray area,
Well,
because
and
he
plus,
didn't.
he was very ambivalent about programs for his symphonies, right?
He certainly did, at certain points of his symphony, say this percussion hit means this person's death. So there were times where there was incredible specificity, and if you ever read, as someone who is not fluent in German by any stretch, sometimes it's not a word or two that you're looking up in Mahler scores, it's a paragraph, because he's going into so much detail. And with this, there are a few musical terms as you go through it, but the score he gives us, the score that was published, very slow. So I would argue that that was his intent with that, and then and he never published that love poem. That kind of came from Alma later. So there's certainly room for debate, I think, but Mahler's intent leaves it more vague.
Well, it seemed to me like the difference between visual art and music is that our vision is so quickly condensed into an objectivity in a way, and music, because it's sort of less specific. Sound, I shouldn't say music, sound is less specific. It exists in a kind of semi-floating world. And so therefore it could remain abstract and reference a more general kind of emotive sense rather than specific things. And that's why it's kind of so rich in its possibilities, because it remains afloat and unattached.
As simple as Hanslick says, where it's sound and time, yet that just is so open and so much in the moment.
Also, science seems to say that our eyes, our visual senses are most developed in us as humans, and our oral sense, our hearing sense is not quite as developed as much as our sight. So music is a little more difficult to comprehend. I mean, you just have to get all the noise out of your head in order to right? In order to,
which is especially hard for us who are alive in this room, where there's a billion stimuli coming into us orally. Absolutely.
Please thank Dr. Malecki.
So, I was thinking of finding a good segue, and you kind of almost articulated one. So the question is music abstract or is it not abstract? In what sphere in our perception does music live? And as a matter of fact, let me take you back all the way to the Middle Ages now. And let's talk about what at that time was considered beautiful in this very ephemeral art form that cannot be held, that cannot be looked at, that cannot be touched, and yet that touches us and has an effect on us. So what aspects of this art form were important to the beginning in our Western culture? This is what I want to focus on, perhaps, today. I was thinking about beauty in music as something that is really, there is no one answer to this. What is beauty in music? This has been redefined every century and keeps being redefined today, I think. So my talk is kind of subtitled Shifting Paradigms. Yes, Shifting Paradigms. Okay. So is music a science, as it used to be, or is music an art? Let me explain what I mean. The astronomer Galileo Galilei observed in 1623 that the entire universe, and I'm quoting, is written in the language of mathematics. And indeed, it is remarkable to note the extent to which science and society are governed by mathematical ideas. It is perhaps even more surprising that music, with all its passion and emotion that we just have considered here, is also based upon mathematical relationships. Such musical notions as the octave, or a chord, or scales, or keys. You've all heard those terms, whether you are in music or not. They can all be demystified and understood logically, simply using simple mathematics. Today, math and music are usually organized into two completely separate categories, separate departments, separate areas of study, without obvious overlap. It is assumed that people are good at math and science or at music and art, as if the two could not be placed together logically. Yet, neurobiological analysis of the brain, which I'm kind of reading again more about now because of the music therapy connection here, shows that music and math rely on similar cognitive processes and activate the same regions in the motor cortex. There is evidence that those pleasurable patterns of rhythm, beat, harmony, and melody that make us want to dance or tap a foot are actually embodied mathematical expressions. This modern scientific discovery, however, merely seems to confirm what was ancient knowledge. Therefore, now, from this perspective, perhaps less surprisingly, from classical antiquity through at least the pre-modern tradition, music was understood and taught as one branch of the mathematical sciences. Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music formed what is called the quadrivium, and that is the foursome of the 7 liberal arts, the kind of tradition in which we at USD are standing, the remaining 3 being the language arts. Again, neurobiological research today shows that practicing music skills activates the same areas in the brain also involved in arithmetic. Both music and math rely on the same spatial temporal cognition skills. For example, the part-whole concept, and maybe Dr. Adler can explain this later because he is the mathematician, I am not. The part-whole concept that is necessary for understanding fractions, decimals, or percent is highly relevant to understanding musical rhythm. A literate musician is required continually to mentally subdivide what we call the beat in music to arrive at the correct interpretation of rhythmic notation, for example. We're constantly counting. It drives my husband crazy. I'm constantly counting. For my perception of time is constantly subdividing it into pulses. And it's okay, anyway. The context has changed, but the structure of the problem is essentially the same as any part-whole problem posed mathematically. For the medieval West, the discovery of the musical/mathematical structures in sound equaled the discovery of order in an apparently chaotic world. And the elements of order in the universe, discoverable equally through math and through music, was conceptualized as beautiful. So order is what makes something beautiful in that thinking. This beauty was described with the words armonia, where we take harmony from, armonia, or perfection. Thus, to understand the laws of music became a practice tool for understanding the perfect order of the universe, which was understood as being willed by a divine creator. The ordered motion of the planets was termed musica universalis, universal music, or the music of the spheres. And Pythagoras, for example, developed this idea that the sun, the moon, and all the planets emit their own unique hum during their orbital revolutions. He posited that the quality of life on Earth reflects the tenor of celestial sounds, which, although they are physically imperceptible to the human ear, are mirrored in musica humana, the inaudible internal music of the human body, and in musica instrumentalis, and that is the human man-made audible music. So he's thinking of three types of music. The music of the spheres, musica universalis, that encompasses all the motions of the heavenly bodies, shall we say. The musica instrumentalis, which reflects this order of the universe in the individual body of the human being. So there is music in all of us, according to Pythagoras. And then the actual audible music making that people make. He asserted that the metaphysical principle that mathematical relationships express qualities of tones, of energy, which manifest in numbers, visual angles, shapes, and sounds, all connected within a pattern of proportion. And this is the main point. Everything is in proportion to everything else. And these proportions, for example, the proportion of the movement of the Earth, the orbit, and so on, as compared to some other planets, they can be expressed through number in mathematical terms, but they can also be expressed in music by applying these mathematical terms to our elements of sound. I will explain that in a second, a little more. So just to stay with Plato for another second here, or to come to Plato, Plato described astronomy and music as twinned studies of sensual recognition. Astronomy for the eyes, music for the ears, and both requiring knowledge of numerical proportions. Okay, so here you see Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, and so on. Do you see this diagram here is full of proportions that are then associated with musical intervals that are also relying on the same proportions that sound is made, for example, by plucking a string. And if you divide the string this way, you get, for example, the interval of a fifth. If you go from here to all the way, the interval of an octave, and so on. So in musical theory, maybe we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so here's all this shown. It's fairly complex. But so let's look at mathematical dimensions of sound. Maybe this is a completely different way of thinking about music for you. So therefore, I'll just will focus on just a few things. So mathematical dimensions of sound include the sonorities. And on the next slide, can you also include rhythms? So go back to the previous one, please, if you would. Sonorities refer, I would say, to the vertical dimension of sound. Vertical dimension in the sense that we have one note and we have another note on top of it or below it. They are vertically kind of stacking up with each other, and together they make what we call an interval, or if you have three of them, a chord, or if you have more of them, different kinds of chords. So that is the vertical dimension of sound. The horizontal dimension of sound, I would say, is the sound in time, and we call that rhythm. So let me talk about this vertical dimension of sound right now. So in music theory, music aesthetics explored the mathematical dimensions of sound, and in practice, composers aimed to structure their music mathematically, thereby tying it in with a cosmological understanding of the universe as an ordered structure engendered by a divine will. Acoustical discoveries were matched with religious ideas where perfection represents the divine and imperfection represents the human. Okay, perfection and imperfection can be expressed both vertically and horizontally in music. The distinction came to define the vertical dimension, namely harmony. Those intervals based on mathematical ratios of simple whole numbers, like 1 to 2, or 2 to 3, or 3 to 4, simple whole numbers, those were considered perfect intervals. So how can I illustrate this quickly? In the Middle Ages, they constructed an instrument. This instrument is called a monochord. And so it's a kind of string instrument with one string. Do you see that here? And now this monochord had a bridge, a movable bridge, that you can use to divide the string and to demonstrate what happens when you divide the string mathematically. So if you have no bridge on it and you just pluck it, it will give you the basic sound. Let's say. Now, if you put the bridge here, now only this part of the string vibrates if you pluck it, or only this if you pluck that, but they don't both vibrate. So you have cut the length that vibrates of the string in half. The ratio is 1 to 2. If you pluck the string without the bridge here, the entire string vibrates. So, bong. Now I put the bridge here and go here, and I pluck it, and out comes bong, an octave higher. You can do it with a rubber band. You know, pull it out this way, pull it out that way, and you'll get that relationship. 1 to 2 will give you an octave, basically. They discovered that if you divide the string 2 to 3, you get the interval of a fifth. Bum, bum. If you divide it 3 to 4, you get the interval of a fourth. Now, those intervals, the octave, the fifth, and the fourth, those were the ones that could be achieved by dividing this string with simple whole numbers. The ratio being simple whole numbers, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. If you now go and want to create other intervals, like ta-tam, that one, which we call a third, suddenly you don't get along with simple whole numbers anymore. But a third is something like the ratio, I don't know, do you know the ratio?
81 to 80.
81 to?
It's 5 to 4.
Yeah, 5 to 4.
It's a pure third.
A pure third, but it's off a little bit. Okay, so now what about a 6?
I don't know.
I think it was something like
6 to 5.
121 over 93 or something. So these are now not simple whole numbers anymore. And if you go to other intervals like the second or the seventh, these ratios, the mathematical ratios needed to produce those sounds, are even more complex. And because of that, Pythagoras already, who discovered this, decided that the only perfect intervals were those at a ratio of 1 to 2, that's the octave, 2 to 3, that's the fifth, and 3 to 4, which is the fourth. And all music that wanted to represent perfection then relied on those intervals, no matter how they sounded. That did not matter to people. It did not matter. It's the theory that's behind it. And the same ratios were discovered again, you know, in the proportions of the different planets, for example, and so on. You need an astronomer to really untangle that. But they are all in here in this diagram. So in other words, we have the perfect consonances. The ones, the third and sixth, they call that the imperfect consonances. And the dissonances are the ones that are the most complex mathematically. And so those were avoided in music. These were used in prominent places, like at the beginning of a phrase, at the end of every phrase, at the end of every section, at the end of the piece as a whole. You simply didn't have a choice other than always coming back to the perfect consonances. And they basically determined what the sound of the music was like. Maybe what we can do is play example number 1 at this point. This is embodied in the 12th century music, when music first started to proliferate and put different melodies on top of each other. Sound of perfect fifth, octave, and fourth all stacked vertically on top of each other. just listen to that. 12th century Paris, Notre Dame Cathedral. Okay, good. So that's the sound, the stark sound, these sonorities of the open intervals, we call them. There is no major in here, no minor. That concept did not exist because it's the third that makes that. How does this strike you, this music?
Beautiful.
Okay. Does it feel warm and subjective, or does it feel objective and maybe, I don't know
A
how?
little cold and
A little cold, remote,
Yes,
Austere.
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 That's a good word.
stark, very strong, but very, very far away, is it not? Not feel-good music, do you think?
But it's not sad either.
No, it's not sad. I'm not asking is it sad or happy. Forget it. That was not even a consideration at the time.
Is it
At all.
ephemeral? Is it
Ephemeral?
It's hard to connect, it's mysterious, it's, I thought it was beautiful.
So,
I do too.
so
But
the problem with our ears is this is so far away from us
yeah,
nowadays from what we're used to hearing.
I think it's already really far away from them in the 12th century. This is the very first polyphonic music that was invented, so to speak. And that, in a way, it wanted to capture the perfection of the divine. Just as the cathedral itself, the building of the Gothic cathedral, that was invented at the same time. This is Gothic style in music, you know, building higher, stacking sounds on top of each other. It's just like the Gothic style in building. You build higher up and up. The whole purpose of it was to touch heaven, basically. And so building up the musical intervals vertically like that, is that vertical? Yes, vertical. Yeah, vertically like that is the same attempt to reach something that is beyond us. That doesn't make us feel good, but makes us feel connected with something larger than us ourselves. So it's perfection in music. And that was equated, of course, with, well, they called it harmonia, which is the goal of being, is to be harmonious within that universe, that the macrocosm, they called it. The microcosm is the human body and the soul, you know, for all that to connect. All right, so this is very briefly the horizontal connection. Now let's do the vertical connection. Now let's do the horizontal. The horizontal has to do with timing of music. Music, of course, as Dr. Malecki said, is sound in time, right? That is the difference with art and whatnot. We're actually, well, it's changing all the time. So what do musicians do? We divide time into pulses, right? There's the beat. And then music works by dividing that basic pulse further and further and further and further, or by duplicating it, or by quadrupling it, or by sextupling it, or whatever, you know, so all your algebra, whatever, is all in there. So you divide by two. We talk about whole notes. They are undivided. Then we talk about half notes, and two of them fit into one whole note. And 4 quarter notes fit into that same time, and so on. So in the Middle Ages, they did the same thing. They divided time and defined the division of one pulse into 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. They defined that as perfect. Why? Because the number 3, of course, has symbolism, is connected with the Trinity, and the Trinity represents the divine, and so human beings' way of connecting with the divine through rhythm was through triple meter. Simple as that. Today we call it a waltz. It's a different idea that's behind that, right? But triple meter, by extension, therefore, is the sacred music. And all sacred music at first, for centuries, if it had any timing at all, calculated timing, it had to be in triple meter. 3 represents the divine. Now, by extension, today, our most common meter is called common time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I mean, 95% of all pop music is in that, you know, and so on. We call it common time. For them, this is based on a division of 2, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's all, every type of common time is divisible by 2. That, however, represented back then the human element, and therefore the imperfect. And therefore, church music was never to be done in imperfect time. So all sacred music, you can recognize it by being in triple meter. What we just heard, 1 da dam da dim da, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, right? If you still recall it now, it has that lilt. And that's not recalling dance or anything like that, but that is the perfection of the number 3 and the symbolism to go with that. Here is a very complicated example. Can you go to the next slide, please? The colorful one? Yes, this. Now, let me take you quickly into the 14th century. The 14th century, again, same place in France, sees the advent of a new type of music called the motet. And in the motet, we have, again, stacking up of different musical lines on top of each other. And in this musical manuscript, this is by Marchot, and this is the original notation in which this piece exists. 2 of the 4 voices of it you see here. This is the tenor, and this is the contratenor here. And you see some notes are black and others are red, and then black again and red, and black and so on. And every time you see a black one here, how does this work? No. It's okay, so they're not arranged in score, but if you would arrange them in a score, you know, actually show the symbols that sound at the same time as the other symbols in this voice, you would see that one of the black sections is superimposed on the red section in the other, and then they flip again, red here and black here, and the other way. So the black represents triple meter, and the red represents duple meter. And that means that there is, in the 14th century, in church music, the possibility of combining the perfect and the imperfect, the divine with the human, and superimposing that on top of each other. And this is all part of isorhythmic motets, and they get very, very complicated. But let's listen to this second musical example, if we could, very briefly, comes from a recording I was involved in 1993 back in Germany, when we did a 3 CD set of music from the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. So this is by Marchot, and let's hear it. Oh yes, thank you. It begins with the other 2 voices that I did not show here, the top voices. One alone first, joined by the second. The intervals that are formed are mostly the perfect intervals here. And I don't want to take up too much more time anyway. So basically, I don't know if you get the idea. You can combine duple and triple meter in this music. Let's quickly move on 100 years further down the line, 15th century. And we are now talking about the total paradigm shift when in both dimensions, the vertical dimension, the harmony, and the horizontal dimension, both of them will now allow the imperfect, and the shift is in how that is perceived or redefined. So what happened was, at the end of the 100-Year War, which is in the 14th century, we have suddenly a tiredness of all this religious perfection, symbolism, and so on, and people want to simply live. And I mean, 100-Year War was pretty devastating, I suppose. And suddenly the question came up, is that really beautiful, what we have defined as perfect so far? Because in England, they had different kind of music. They had different sonorities. And the French and the English had met during the war, and so that meant their cultures had met. And the French had suddenly heard the English countenance, they called it, the countenance anglaise, which could also be translated as the angelic countenance. All right? And that meant they had heard parallel thirds and sixths. All of a sudden, these sounds that were not anymore these austere sounds of the fifth and the fourth and these open intervals, but suddenly the warm sounds of the thirds and the sixths. And the French, of course, eat this up and imitate this. Can we go to this slide, please? This musical example, please? And so, in the hands of Guillaume Dufay, exactly 100 years after Marchot, he's bringing in the thirds and the sixths, and just see if you can hear the difference, if it sounds more typical for us, because now suddenly you can hear major chords and minor chords. Let me just hear that briefly. Right here, that's a major chord. And here's another one. And isn't it as if the sun just suddenly came up? Most people immediately start to smile there. And right here, you can stop the example right here. C major chord. Aren't you all smiling? Thank you so much. That's my point. So then this became beautiful, and suddenly the whole philosophy behind music changed. We want now what is pleasurable to the ear, the people in the 15th century say, and I have to say with that, probably it's the beginning of the disconnection between math and music, and suddenly, not suddenly, it takes another 400 years roughly, music becomes an art whose purpose it is to express emotion, and not anymore the order of the universe. And then we're with Hanslick and Mahler and so on. Then the question, of course, becomes, well, whose emotions? What emotions? You know, what is expressed in music? You know, as you heard from Dr. Malecki. In early music, I can tell you exactly what it's about. Because it's not about human emotions. It's about a philosophical idea of the cosmos, basically. How does the microcosm fit into the macrocosm? How do they all share the same kind of motion? Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll do it as quick as I can. Like I said, I'm trying to make an argument here because when Brian asked me to do this, I immediately knew what I wanted to talk about. Because it's like, after 20 years, I get a chance to talk about my pet peeve. To be more accurate, one of very many pet peeves. But I'm a practitioner of modern music, so I did want to talk in particular about dissonance. And in particular, I would like to explore some of the ways that discourse about dissonance contributes to a popular predisposition about modern music. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Predisposition against modern music. Here we go. Okay, so in 2010, Alex Ross, who's a very excellent music critic, published this article in The Guardian, Why Do We Hate Classical Music? Very thoughtfully examining the cultural conditions that perpetuate audience difficulty with modern music, and offering an encouragement to overcome those conditions. The piece generated extensive online discussion, and many of those in opposition repeated assertions that have attended modern music for a century and remain typical. Here's one basically chosen at random. Even after a century, the public does not accept the amelodic, dissonant car crash, sound effect-driven compositional output of the modernist school as music. Thank you very much. It is ultimately audience acceptance that drives composition, not the other way around. While we have been on a bit of a detour for the last 100 years, that should be long enough to declare the modernist agenda a failure and move on to something that people do like. So while there's a lot to unpack here, not least of which the assumption that the value of a musical tradition is measured by mass popularity, that's another one of my pet peeves, I would like to pay particular attention to the role that dissonance plays in this kind of discourse. And it's really easy to find. Thank you, Nicholas Slonimsky, for this great book, A Lexicon of Musical Invective. Here's what people had to say about Schoenberg in 1912. 5 orchestral pieces by Arnold Schoenberg forming Essay in Dissonance. It was like a poem in Tibetan. Not one single soul could possibly have understood it. Igor Stravinsky, we know this piece already. The most essential characteristic of the Sacre the Rite of Spring is that it is the most dissonant and most discordant composition yet written. Never was a system in the cult of the wrong note practice with so much industry, zeal, and fury. Even Aaron Copland, our beloved American composer, it seems to be dissonance for the sake of dissonance. It is, of all sounds, the most illogical, the most anti-human. That's about Aaron Copland. Come on. But anyway, you can actually find this as you go further back in time. This is so much fun. In search of ear-rending dissonances, torturous transitions, sharp modulations, repugnant contortions of melody and rhythm, Chopin is and this is actually my favorite. All impartial musicians and music lovers were in perfect agreement. Think of that quote that I just read you a few minutes ago. That never was anything as incoherent, shrill, chaotic, and ear-splitting produced in music. The most piercing dissonances clash in a really atrocious harmony, and a few puny ideas only increase the disagreeable and deafening effect. And this is referring to a piece by the lesser-known composer Ludwig van Beethoven. Anyway, this may be summed up in the following conventional wisdom. Modern music is dissonant, dissonance sounds bad, therefore modern music is ugly. By modern music, I'm referring, as we sort of often do, without a lot of musicological specificity. Contemporary music, new music, avant-garde music, what have you. Even though the modern musical era now spans over a century, on par with other historical style periods, popular characterization of the music as too new or eminently rejectable persists. In fact, it is common for audience members and even fellow musicians to express this sentiment in polite company, and I swear this is true. Like, if you went to a Chinese opera or a Native American powwow and you heard the music and you said to the performers, you know what, I really didn't like this, but everybody knows it sounds bad, so it's all right, right? People say that to me all the time. So it's like actually a real thing. It's like how ethnocentric and extraordinarily inappropriate that is, but people do it all the time. So that's why it becomes one of my pet peeves. So anyway, what I'd like to propose, I'm going to dig into these two things. And basically what I'd like to propose is that the discourse that we have about dissonances purports to plays a role in purporting to ground this kind of closed-mindedness in objective fact, providing an aura of empirical legitimacy to the knee-jerk rejection of an established musical tradition. So how does this work? In order to do this, we're going to go back in time almost to where Dr. Pfau left off. So let us first examine dissonance by looking at the early theorists of Western music who sought to reveal the order underlying the music of their contemporaries. They described what we call counterpoint, or the basis of polyphonic music, which is what we were just listening to. And they understand this in terms of the relationships between consonance and dissonance, what we now call dissonance treatment. Most importantly, it is not a characterization of individual sounds, as it is stereotypically presented, no offense, but it is a system of structuring relationships between sonorities in succession. So here from Zarlino, an early music theorist, every composition, counterpoint, or harmony is composed principally of consonances. Nevertheless, for greater beauty and charm, dissonances are used, incidentally and secondarily. Although these dissonances are not pleasing in isolation, that's a matter of opinion, when they are properly placed, the ear not only endures them, but derives great pleasure and delight from them. Another theorist, developing on Zarlino's theory, the senses become satisfied with them, not because they harmonize, but because of the gentle mixture of sweet and strong. Which is a beautiful notion, and I think a good analog for this is a chili pepper. If you eat one, you will be very miserable. But with just the right amount in your food, it brings it to life. So this is kind of how they're thinking about dissonance. Now, somewhat contemporaneously, how is dissonance used in a non-musical context? So go to the OED, and we can see from its very early uses, it is not sweet, but barbarous, false, harsh. And what I'm proposing is that there is a slippage between this kind of colloquial usage of dissonance as a negative aesthetic judgment and its technical use in music theory. And this slippage is responsible for its deployment in rationalizing distaste. So this is actually exactly what Dr. Pfau was talking about, presented slightly differently with music notation. This is Johann Fuchs. I'll skip this part. He gave us a teaching method based on Zarlino's theory of dissonance. We still use this today. Bach used this, Mozart used this. I teach it to my students every other semester. And basically it's a theory of partitioning all the possible vertical musical intervals into two groups. The consonant ones that sound good, and the dissonant ones that sound bad. But he doesn't say, use those, don't use those. He teaches you how to use them. So it's a relational system that employs both. And students spend a lot of time sort of working their way through the challenges of doing that. But this is the key principle. When there's another aspect, it gets a little technical, but it has to be reckoned against the bass. You use the bass voice to determine the interval, and one of the things that means is that dissonant intervals appear between the upper voices all the time. So in fact, dissonance is not an innate quality of a musical interval, it is only through context does something become dissonant. This is a key principle of Zarlino's theory. And we can see this in action. I actually have audio examples, but I'm going to trust your ears. And save time by not playing it, because musical excerpts are kind of unfulfilling anyway. Fuchs used Palestrina as a model, not dissimilar to the music we were just listening to. I've labeled all the intervals that are consonant and all the ones that are dissonant. The important thing is the dissonances occupy about 25% of the musical time. Okay? According to Fuchs's theory of dissonance. If we go forward in time, this is, again, I won't play it, so please trust me, a very beautiful piece by J.S. Bach. There ought not to be any doubt. Performing a similar analysis, which takes quite a bit of time, because it's every interval against the bass, you get almost exactly the same thing. About 23.5% of the musical time is occupied by dissonances against the bass voice. Mozart. It's worth reading this quote. This is by Maynard Solomon, a musicologist who specializes in Mozart. The opening bars of Mozart's dissonance string quartet. Incidentally, this string quartet is nicknamed the Dissonance, not by Mozart, but because it was a very adventurous composition by Mozart at the time. It immediately plunges into the center of symbiotic terror. Here, Mozart has simulated the very process of creation, showing the lineaments of chaos at the moment of its conversion into form. He has created an unprecedented network of disorientations, dissonances, rhythmic exurities, and atmospheric dislocations. To me, that sounds awesome, but it sounds like it's describing Schoenberg or maybe like a post-World War II experimental composer, not Mozart. So you crunch the numbers and you get pretty much the same thing. It's 24% dissonance. It's exactly the same as Bach. And this is the first inkling that Fuchs's theory of dissonance is not telling us what we need to know. Going forward in time, again, Chopin can actually be quite harmonically adventurous and chromatic in his music. This is not one of those examples. This is a very sort of charming and simple little thing. 42% dissonance. Something weird is going on. And finally, Arnold Schoenberg, a climactic moment from one of his early so-called atonal pieces. Arnold Schoenberg is that composer that people still love to hate, sort of epitomizes what it means to be modern in music. Very dissonant passage with sort of crashing chords and chromatic winding lines, and you crunch the numbers and you get 38% dissonance, even less than Chopin. So, my main point with this little demonstration is that the concept of dissonance as we generally understood it is entirely inappropriate for understanding our affective experience of what we are colloquially calling dissonance. Okay? So step forward in time. Helmholtz comes up with a new theory of dissonance based on mathematical and acoustical terms. So drawing on the idea of tuning based on low integer ratios, which we just learned about from Dr. Pfau, he proposes that dissonance arises due to beating between the upper partials of simultaneous sounds, causing combinations to have an audible roughness. This means treating dissonance as a quality of sound independent from context, which does not comport with Fuchs nor with our statistical survey, nor is it consistent with the richness or subtlety of what it means to be in tune in the Western tradition or really any other tradition. Nonetheless, Helmholtz's theory has been very influential on research into music perception for over a century, as exemplified by this quote here from John R. Pierce, the author of a popular science text. I believe the rules and customs are based on experiences of consonance and dissonance that are inherent in normal hearing. For many decades, the emphasis of research into music perception has proceeded by examining the perception of acoustical components in isolation, That is, separating them from their musical context, not what Pfau says to do. By isolating musical sounds from actual music, they are no longer experienced in the same way as music. And so aesthetic evaluation of these sounds does not necessarily inform our understanding of the musical experience. The authors of studies like these may be more or less circumspect about their conclusions, but when these results are covered in the press or enter public discourse, they are too often read as science explaining music and can garner a surprising amount of attention, which I think is indicative of our collective desire to understand how music moves us, and a recognition that its power to do so remains mysterious. But seriously, like, does anybody really take does it make you feel better knowing that a baby chicken hears consonants and dissonances the way it doesn't work for me? Besides the problem of aesthetically evaluating sounds outside of a musical context, another problem is the cultural situation of music perception. And in fact, this problem of the ethnocentricity of experiments that purport to ground selected organizational principles of Western music in human biology was recognized as early as 1928 by psychologist Martha Guernsey. And this recognition of the cultural relativism of musical experience was one of the key tenets of the discipline of ethnomusicology when it emerged in the 1950s. But these arguments did not have much impact on music perception research. I won't take the time to read that, but it's a really nice quote, and actually really remarkable that she's sort of sensing this problem so early on, because 80 years later, some of you may be familiar with this book, it got a lot of coverage by Anirudh Patel because he was at the Neurosciences Institute until just recently. He had to make exactly the same argument. This is 2011, I think it was published, and he says, I'm paraphrasing, he points out the problem of isolating musical parameters from their context, noting that the quality of intervals are experienced subjectively, varying between individuals and cultures. And he notes that the studies have almost exclusively involved subjects from the US, Germany, and Japan, while the predictions tested are purportedly universal. Few researchers have attempted to address this problem, but this recent 2016 study published in Nature was one of the first also to garner media attention and suggests empirical evidence for cultural relativism in music perception. Pretty interesting, you can find it online, but basically they found a tribe in the Amazon that had never heard any Western music, and so they tested all these perception principles and found out all the stuff they thought they knew was wrong, right? To the extent that you can trust a study based on, but it's sort of an interesting methodology they came up with. In fact, discontent over the concept of dissonance has been brewing for half a century. One of the pioneers of music perception research concluded in 1969 that musical science would be better if this concept were dropped from the scholarly literature. Another researcher who has sought to ground musical aesthetics in terms of expectation, who has done cross-cultural experiments in music perception, David Huron, one of those experiments he did with our David Harnish, they were collaborators on that research, says the concept of dissonance is one of the most complicated and contentious in music scholarship. He suggests refining the concept to distinguish between sensory dissonance, the experience of a sound as clangorous and independent of context, and tension dissonance that arises relationally. We can skip that step. This is David Huron's book, which is quite fascinating, actually. To bring it back to modern music, I think there are many reasons why audiences find modern music challenging, including the fragmentation and diversification of musical language in the 20th century, a somewhat theatrical antipathy towards older musical traditions among some modernist movements, the deliberate amplification of sonic markers of subcultural difference, which in some cases includes those intervals which are different, sort of favoring those distant intervals for the sake of sounding bad, and the shift away from musical experience and towards the consumption of recordings that has precipitated a steep decline in music literacy. All these factors contribute to an inability to predict the succession of musical events, which according to David Huron's expectation theory is a stronger predictor of confusion, and therefore dissonance in the colloquial sense, than a music theoretic concept of dissonance. So we have the colloquial notion of dissonance as a highly subjective sense of unpleasantness or unpredictability, and a music theoretic concept of consonants and dissonances that is at best poorly defined and is largely uncorrelated to affective musical experience. The slippage between these notions leads to the false idea that modern music is dissonant and therefore ugly. And this gives it this sort of sense of being sort of grounded in science or something. So finally, the passion, intensity, beauty, and meaning that we derive from the experience of music does not arise from its constituent parts in isolation, and we should be skeptical of claims to the universality of music perception, whether they pertain to those constituent parts or to the totality. Music is and will remain, after all, a humanistic discipline. To wrap it up, here's how Aaron Copland, the notorious dissonant composer Aaron Copland, answers this question. Why must new music be so dissonant? A satisfactory reply to this troublesome question is exceedingly difficult because of the fact that a dissonance in music is a purely relative thing. What sounds dissonant to you may sound quite mellifluous to me. The whole history of Western music proves that our ear tends to increase its capacity for considering pleasurable chords which in former times were considered painfully discordant. If you find yourself rejecting music because it is too dissonant, it probably indicates that your ear is insufficiently accustomed to contemporary musical vocabulary and needs more training, that is, listening. Reading about the dissonant chord does not make it sound any sweeter, but repeated hearing certainly does. So with that in mind, I encourage you all to add some spice to your and listen to some dissonant modern music. Thank you.